Two men, $100 billion, complete control over American politics. While Jeff Bezos built Amazon, while Elon Musk conquered space, Charles and David Koch did something far more ambitious. They bought democracy itself, not just politicians, not just elections. They purchased the entire machinery that decides what Americans think, vote for, and believe. By 2020, their network had spent more money influencing politics than the Republican and Democratic parties combined. More than Google, Facebook, and Apple's lobbying budgets put together, they created a political operation so sophisticated that most Americans have never heard their names, yet live under laws they wrote. But what nobody knows is how they started with a single oil refinery in Kansas and built the most powerful shadow government in American history. How they turned their father's Nazi connections into a blueprint for subverting democracy. How they convinced millions of working-class Americans to vote against their own economic interests. This isn't just about money-buying influence. This is about two brothers who looked at American democracy and decided it was for sale. Then spent 60 years proving they were right. The Koch network doesn't just lobby politicians, they create the politicians. They don't just fund campaigns, they build the entire ecosystem that determines who runs, what they believe, and how they govern. Universities, think tanks, grassroots organizations, legal foundations, media outlets, all secretly coordinated by two men most Americans couldn't pick out of a lineup. This is the story of how the Koch brothers turned capitalism into oligarchy, how they weaponized libertarian ideology to protect their monopoly, and how they proved that in America, democracy is just another commodity to be bought and sold. Charles Koch today controls a business empire worth $125 billion. His political network spans 38 states, employs over 3,500 operatives, and coordinates the activities of 700 organizations. He has shaped Supreme Court decisions, rewritten state constitutions, and influenced federal policy on everything from environmental protection to voting rights. Yet 60 years ago, Charles Koch was just another rich kid inheriting daddy's oil business in Wichita, Kansas. The gap between those two realities reveals something fundamental about American power. While most billionaires content themselves with buying yachts and sports teams, the Koch brothers understood that true wealth comes from owning the system itself. Not just making money within capitalism, but controlling the rules that govern capitalism. What made them different wasn't just their inheritance. Plenty of rich kids squander family fortunes. It wasn't even their business acumen, though they did grow Koch Industries into America's second-largest private company. What made them unique was their recognition that political power is the ultimate multiplier of economic power. Most wealthy individuals donate to campaigns and hire lobbyists. The Kochs built something unprecedented, a private political party with its own candidates, ideology, messaging apparatus, and grassroots army. They created what political scientists call a shadow party, all the functions of a major political organization, but with none of the transparency or accountability. Behind their success was a simple insight that would reshape American democracy. Traditional political influence was retail, buying individual politicians for specific votes. The Kochs went wholesale, purchasing entire ideological movements, complete judicial philosophies, and systematic policy changes that would benefit them for decades. This wasn't just about protecting their oil and chemical businesses from environmental regulations, though that was certainly part of it. The brothers understood that true influence meant changing how Americans think about the proper role of government, the nature of freedom, and the relationship between wealth and power. Let me take you back to 1961, when a 26-year-old Charles Koch took control of his father's company and began planning what would become the most ambitious political project in American history. The United States was at the height of the New Deal consensus. High taxes on the wealthy, strong unions, expanding social programs, and growing environmental protections threatened everything the Koch family had built. Most business leaders of that era accepted this reality and worked within the system. Charles Koch decided to change the system itself. The timing was perfect. America in the 1960s was fragmenting along cultural and political lines. The civil rights movement, Vietnam War protests, and counterculture rebellion had shattered the post-war consensus. Traditional institutions were losing legitimacy. People were questioning everything from government authority to social hierarchies. Into this chaos, the Koch brothers inserted a carefully crafted alternative vision. Radical free market ideology wrapped in the language of personal liberty. They didn't just oppose specific policies, they challenged the fundamental legitimacy of democratic governance when it conflicted with market outcomes. But here's what most people don't know. The Koch political project began not with Charles and David, but with their father Fred, who spent the 1930s building oil refineries for Stalin's Soviet Union and Hitler's Nazi Germany. Fred Koch learned something crucial from those experiences, that ordinary people could be convinced to support systems that worked against their own interests if you controlled the information they received and the choices they were offered. Fred passed this lesson to his sons along with his fortune. Charles and David would apply it not to build refineries for dictators, but to build a political machine that could function within American democracy while systematically undermining democratic governance. The result was something political scientists had never seen before. A shadow political system that operated in parallel to official government, with its own policy development process, its own candidate recruitment and training programs, its own messaging and mobilization networks. What makes the Koch story so significant isn't just the scale of their influence, but how invisible they managed to keep it. While other wealthy political donors sought public recognition for their contributions, the Kochs perfected the art of anonymous power. They created a network so complex and decentralized that even sophisticated observers couldn't track its full scope. This approach allowed them to avoid the political backlash that typically constrains concentrated wealth in democratic societies. They could shape policy debates, fund grassroots movements, and influence elections while maintaining plausible deniability about their role. But to understand how two brothers from Kansas built this shadow empire, we need to go back to where it all began, with their father's oil business and the dark lessons he learned about power, politics, and human nature during the most turbulent decades of the 20th century. December 1967. Charles Koch stands in his father's study, holding documents that will reshape American politics forever. Fred Koch had just died, leaving behind more than an oil company. He had bequeathed his sons a complete worldview about power, politics, and the dangerous threat of democratic government. What Charles discovered in those papers would become the blueprint for the most sophisticated political operation in American history. Fred Koch hadn't just built a business empire. He had built it by collaborating with some of the 20th century's most brutal regimes, learning harsh lessons about how to manipulate public opinion and undermine democratic institutions. The story begins in 1927 when a young Fred Koch graduated from MIT with a chemical engineering degree and an innovative oil refining process. American oil companies, threatened by his superior technology, sued him into near bankruptcy. Patent disputes and legal challenges consumed years of his life and most of his money. That experience taught Fred Koch his first crucial lesson. In America, established wealth uses government power to crush competition. The legal system wasn't neutral. It was a weapon wielded by those with the resources to hire better lawyers and buy political influence. Blocked from expanding in the United States, Fred took his technology overseas. In 1929, he signed a deal to build refineries for Stalin's Soviet Union. Over the next decade, he would construct 15 oil installations across the USSR, generating enormous profits while witnessing firsthand how authoritarian governments manipulated their populations. Fred wrote detailed observations about Soviet propaganda techniques in letters to his wife. He was fascinated by how the communist regime convinced ordinary Russians to support policies that clearly worked against their interests. The key, he noted, was controlling information flow and creating simple narratives that explained complex problems. But Fred's most troubling partnership came in the late 1930s, when he began building refineries for Nazi Germany. As Hitler prepared for war, Fred Koch's technology helped fuel the Wehrmacht's early victories. These contracts made him phenomenally wealthy and taught him his second crucial lesson about power. Democratic governments, Fred observed, were inherently unstable because they allowed ordinary people to interfere with rational economic planning. Both Stalin and Hitler, despite their obvious brutality, could implement long-term strategies without worrying about public opinion or electoral cycles. Fred returned to Kansas in 1940 a changed man. He had witnessed the power of authoritarian efficiency, but he also understood that such overt control was impossible in America. Instead, he began developing more subtle approaches to political influence. The post-war era frustrated Fred Koch enormously. High taxes, strong labor unions, and New Deal regulations constrained his business expansion. He watched the federal government grow larger and more intrusive, implementing policies that redistributed wealth from entrepreneurs like himself to ordinary workers. In 1958, Fred helped found the John Birch Society, a secretive organization dedicated to fighting communist infiltration of American institutions. But the real infiltration Fred worried about wasn't foreign, it was democratic. He genuinely believed that allowing working-class Americans to vote on economic policy was a form of theft. Fred Koch's political philosophy was remarkably consistent. Democracy was acceptable only when it produced outcomes that served wealthy interests. When it didn't, when voters chose higher taxes, stronger regulations, or expanded social programs, then democracy needed to be constrained or circumvented. This wasn't mere self-interest. Fred had developed a sophisticated ideological framework that portrayed his economic preferences as moral imperatives. Taxation was theft. Regulation was tyranny. Social programs were slavery. Any government action that redistributed wealth or constrained business freedom was, by definition, unjust. Charles Koch absorbed these lessons during long conversations with his father throughout the 1950s. Unlike his brothers, who showed little interest in politics, Charles displayed an almost scholarly fascination with ideology and systems thinking. When Fred died in 1967, Charles inherited both the family business and its political mission. But Charles understood something his father hadn't. Open opposition to democracy was politically toxic in America. The key was to attack democratic governance while claiming to defend democratic values. Charles spent months studying his father's papers, correspondence, and strategic notes. What emerged was a sophisticated understanding of how to build political power while avoiding political accountability. The plan Charles developed was brilliantly simple. Instead of opposing democracy directly, they would redefine it. Instead of attacking government overtly, they would capture it covertly. Instead of defending privilege explicitly, they would package their agenda as freedom itself. Charles understood that successful political influence required three elements his father had never mastered: intellectual legitimacy, grassroots authenticity, and ideological coherence. You couldn't just buy politicians. You had to create the entire intellectual ecosystem that produced politicians who already believed what you wanted them to believe. This insight would prove revolutionary. Previous generations of wealthy political donors had focused on transactional relationships with individual lawmakers. Charles envisioned something far more ambitious, reshaping the fundamental premises of American political debate. By 1970, Charles Koch had articulated what would become the guiding principle of his political project. The role of business is to make profits, not to solve social problems. But he understood that implementing this philosophy required solving a massive political problem, convincing Americans to abandon 60 years of democratic reforms that had constrained business power. The solution wasn't to argue against those reforms directly. The solution was to create an alternative intellectual framework that made those reforms appear illegitimate, ineffective, and ultimately harmful to the very people they claimed to help. Charles began quietly funding academic research, policy institutes, and intellectual networks that could provide scholarly credibility for radical free market positions. He wasn't buying specific policy outcomes. He was investing in the long-term project of changing how Americans thought about the relationship between wealth, power, and freedom. Most observers at the time dismissed this approach as the hobby of an eccentric Kansas businessman. They couldn't imagine that ideas developed in obscure think tanks and academic journals could eventually reshape Supreme Court jurisprudence, rewrite state constitutions, and transform American governance. But Charles Koch understood something that traditional politicians missed. In democratic societies, power ultimately flows from ideas, Control the ideas, and you control everything else. The foundation was set. The inheritance was more than money. It was a complete political strategy developed through decades of studying how democratic systems could be manipulated and undermined. Now Charles just needed a partner who could help him implement it on a scale that would shock even their father. That partner was already working in the family business, quietly building his own expertise in the dark arts of political influence. His name was David Koch, and he was about to prove that democracy really was for sale if you had enough money and patience to buy it properly. 1973. Charles Koch sits in his Wichita office, staring at a problem that would reshape American democracy. President Nixon had just imposed price controls on oil, responding to public anger about corporate profiteering during the energy crisis. For most business leaders, this was simply another regulatory challenge to navigate. For Charles Koch, it was proof that democracy itself was the enemy of rational economic policy. The solution wasn't better lobbying or campaign contributions. The solution was systematic ideological transformation of American political culture. Charles had spent the previous 5 years studying how ideas become political movements. He read extensively about the Mont Pelerin Society, a secretive network of free market intellectuals founded by economist Friedrich Hayek in 1947. He analyzed how progressive reformers had built institutional support for New Deal policies. He even studied how communist parties had gained influence in democratic societies. What emerged from this research was a startling insight. Successful political movements weren't built around individual politicians or specific policies. They were built around comprehensive worldviews that offered simple explanations for complex problems. Charles understood that the American political system in the 1970s was experiencing a crisis of legitimacy. Vietnam, Watergate, and economic stagflation had shattered public confidence in government institutions. Traditional authorities were being questioned. People were searching for new ways to understand their economic and political circumstances. Into this intellectual vacuum, Charles intended to insert a fully developed alternative framework, radical libertarianism, disguised as common sense. The brilliance of this approach wasn't just its ambition, it was its patience. While other wealthy donors focused on immediate electoral outcomes, Charles was thinking in generational terms. He wanted to change not just who won elections, but what winning candidates believed about the proper role of government. Charles began by identifying the key intellectual and institutional infrastructure that shaped American political discourse. Universities produced the scholars whose research influenced policy debates. Think tanks translated academic ideas into policy proposals. Legal organizations developed constitutional theories that guided judicial decisions. Media outlets determined which ideas reached public attention. Rather than trying to influence this existing infrastructure, Charles decided to build a parallel system entirely under his control. The project began modestly in 1974, when Charles established the Charles Koch Foundation to fund libertarian scholarship. Unlike traditional philanthropists who gave money to existing institutions, Charles attached strict conditions to his grants. Recipients had to promote specific free market positions and coordinate their work with his broader political objectives. Charles wasn't funding independent research. He was purchasing intellectual ammunition for an ideological war. The Foundation's early grants revealed the scope of Charles's ambitions. He funded economists who argued that environmental regulations cost more lives than they saved. He supported legal scholars who claimed that campaign finance restrictions violated free speech rights. He backed political scientists who contended that democratic governance was inherently inefficient compared to market mechanisms. Most importantly, Charles began building networks that connected these scattered intellectuals into a coherent movement. He organized conferences where libertarian academics could meet, collaborate, and coordinate their research agendas. He created fellowship programs that trained young scholars in free market ideology. He established publication outlets that could disseminate their ideas to broader audiences. By 1976, Charles had articulated what he called the Kochtopus, a deliberately engineered ecosystem of organizations that could shape political discourse at every level, from academic research to grassroots activism. But Charles understood that intellectual influence alone wasn't sufficient. Ideas needed institutional vehicles to reach ordinary voters. This insight led to the second phase of his strategy, creating fake grassroots movements that could mobilize public support for policies that primarily benefited wealthy interests. The template came from studying how progressive movements had built popular support for New Deal reforms. Charles observed that successful political change required the appearance of spontaneous citizen activism, even when that activism was actually funded and coordinated by elite interests. In 1977, Charles co-founded the Cato Institute with Edward Crane, creating the first major think tank explicitly dedicated to advancing libertarian policy positions. Unlike existing conservative organizations, which focused primarily on social issues, Cato concentrated exclusively on economic policies that would reduce government constraints on business activity. Cato's research agenda was remarkably consistent with Koch Industries' business interests. The institute opposed environmental regulations that affected the oil industry, labor protections that constrained chemical manufacturing, and financial oversight that limited energy trading. But Cato presented these positions as principled defenses of individual liberty rather than corporate self-interest. This ideological packaging proved crucial to the Koch political project's long-term success. By framing their business agenda in terms of fundamental American values, freedom, individualism, limited government, they could build broad coalitions that included people who had no direct economic stake in Koch Industries' profitability. Charles also understood that successful political movements needed visible leaders who could articulate their message to broader audiences. In 1979, he recruited his younger brother David to serve as the Libertarian Party's vice presidential candidate. David Koch's campaign platform revealed the radical nature of the brothers' political vision. He called for abolishing the Federal Reserve, the CIA, the FBI, the Department of Education, Social Security, Medicare, and virtually every federal agency created since 1900. He advocated eliminating all taxes except user fees and voluntary contributions. The Libertarian ticket received only 1% of the vote, but the campaign served a crucial strategic purpose. It allowed the Koch brothers to test their messaging, build organizational capacity, and identify potential supporters across the country. More importantly, the campaign demonstrated that Americans weren't ready for openly radical free market policies. Charles learned that successful political influence required more sophisticated packaging and incremental implementation. This realization led to the third phase of Koch political strategy, infiltrating and capturing existing conservative institutions rather than building entirely new ones. Charles recognized that the Republican Party in the early 1980s was experiencing its own identity crisis. Ronald Reagan's electoral success had created space for more aggressive free market policies, but the party establishment remained committed to moderate positions on many economic issues. Rather than trying to change the Republican Party directly, Charles decided to create parallel institutions that could gradually shift conservative opinion toward more radical positions. He began funding existing conservative organizations while simultaneously establishing new ones that could coordinate a more systematic ideological transformation. The key insight was understanding how political coalitions actually function. Conservative movements weren't monolithic. They included religious traditionalists concerned about social issues, defense hawks focused on foreign policy, and business interests worried about economic regulations. Charles realized that he could build influence within conservative coalitions by funding organizations that appealed to each constituency while gradually steering them toward positions that served Koch business interests. By 1980, Charles Koch had created the intellectual foundation for a political revolution. He had established think tanks that could provide academic credibility for radical free market positions. He had built networks that connected libertarian intellectuals across multiple disciplines. He had tested messaging strategies that could make corporate welfare look like individual freedom. Most importantly, he had developed a systematic understanding of how to build political power while avoiding political accountability. The Koch network could shape policy debates, influence elections, and capture government institutions while maintaining plausible deniability about coordination or control. What Charles needed next was the organizational capacity to implement this strategy on a scale that could actually transform American governance. That would require recruiting allies, building institutional infrastructure, and creating funding mechanisms that could sustain long-term political engagement. The foundation was complete. Now came the hard work of construction, building a shadow political system that could function in parallel to official democracy while systematically undermining democratic governance itself. January 1981. In a luxury hotel conference room in Palm Springs, California, 17 of America's wealthiest men gather for a secret meeting that will reshape the country's political landscape. Charles Koch stands at the head of the table, presenting what he calls the structure of social change. It's not a business proposal, it's a revolutionary manifesto disguised as academic theory. We have focused too much on political action and not enough on intellectual development, Charles tells the assembled billionaires. We need to create the intellectual raw material, and the rest will follow. The men around that table control hundreds of billions in assets. They own oil companies, chemical manufacturers, financial institutions, and media empires. But Charles Koch is proposing something unprecedented, coordinating their political activities into a unified force that could systematically transform American governance. This wasn't just another donor meeting. This was the birth of what political scientists would later call the most sophisticated influence network in American history. Charles had spent the previous 3 years studying how successful political movements build institutional capacity. He analyzed how labor unions coordinated political action across multiple industries. He examined how progressive organizations had built the coalition that supported New Deal reforms. He even studied how revolutionary movements had captured political power in other countries. What he discovered was that sustainable political influence required 3 critical elements: intellectual legitimacy, organizational infrastructure, and long-term coordination among elite interests. Most wealthy political donors focused on short-term electoral outcomes, funding individual candidates or specific ballot initiatives. Charles envisioned something far more ambitious, building permanent institutional capacity that could shape political discourse for decades. The genius of Charles's approach was recognizing that political influence in America had become fragmented and inefficient. Conservative donors were funding hundreds of separate organizations with overlapping missions and competing agendas. Liberal donors were more coordinated, but their networks were visible and therefore vulnerable to political attack. Charles proposed creating a structure of social change that would coordinate conservative political activity while maintaining the appearance of independence among participating organizations. The structure had 4 distinct levels. At the top were intellectual institutions, universities, think tanks, and research organizations that could provide academic credibility for conservative policy positions. These organizations would develop the theoretical frameworks that justified specific political positions. The second level consisted of policy institutions, advocacy organizations that could translate academic research into specific legislative proposals. These groups would take ideas developed by think tanks and turn them into actual bills that could be introduced in Congress or state legislatures. The third level involved political institutions, organizations that could influence electoral outcomes through campaign contributions, voter mobilization, and candidate recruitment. These groups would ensure that politicians who supported conservative positions could win elections and advance in their careers. The fourth level comprised education and outreach institutions, media outlets, grassroots organizations, and citizen groups that could build public support for conservative policies. These organizations would create the appearance of popular demand for policies that primarily served elite interests. What made this structure revolutionary wasn't just its comprehensiveness, it was its coordination. Unlike traditional political networks, which operated as loose coalitions of independent organizations, the Koch structure functioned as an integrated system with centralized strategic planning and coordinated messaging. Charles understood that successful political influence required controlling not just what people thought about specific issues, but how they thought about the relationship between wealth, power, and freedom. The Palm Springs meeting established the basic framework for what would become known as the Koch network, a collection of over 700 organizations that could influence American politics at every level, from local school boards to federal Supreme Court appointments. The initial group of donors committed to contributing $1 million annually to support this coordinated political infrastructure. But Charles insisted that participation required more than money. It required ideological commitment to the broader project of transforming American governance. Each donor was expected to fund specific types of organizations based on their expertise and interests. Oil industry executives would support environmental policy research. Financial industry leaders would fund economic policy institutes. Manufacturing executives would back labor relations organizations. This approach allowed the network to develop deep expertise in every policy area that affected business interests while maintaining plausible deniability about coordination between different issue areas. The network's first major success came in 1982, when it helped defeat several ballot initiatives that would have imposed stricter environmental regulations on chemical manufacturing. Rather than opposing these measures directly as business interests, the network funded citizen groups that framed environmental protection as government overreach that would harm working families. The campaign demonstrated the power of coordinated messaging across multiple platforms. Think tank research proved that environmental regulations destroyed jobs. Policy organizations proposed alternative approaches that relied on market mechanisms. Political groups funded candidates who supported business-friendly positions. Grassroots organizations mobilized voters who believed they were defending economic freedom rather than corporate profits. Most importantly, the campaign showed how the network could shape public debate by controlling the information that voters received about complex policy issues. Charles realized that traditional political influence had focused too much on changing minds and not enough on selecting minds. Instead of trying to convince existing voters to support conservative positions, the network could identify and mobilize people who were already predisposed to those positions but weren't politically active. This insight led to the development of sophisticated voter targeting techniques that would later revolutionize American electoral politics. Using consumer data and psychological profiling, the network could identify individuals who were likely to support conservative positions on economic issues, even if they had never voted or engaged in political activity. The network then developed customized messaging strategies for different demographic groups. Rural voters received information about government threats to traditional ways of life. Suburban voters heard about tax burdens and regulatory constraints on small businesses. Urban voters learned about how government programs created dependency and reduced individual opportunity. Each message was technically accurate but carefully framed to promote specific political outcomes that served the network's broader objectives. By 1984, the Koch network had established a permanent political infrastructure that could operate independently of electoral cycles. Unlike traditional political organizations, which ramped up activity during campaign seasons and went dormant between elections, the network maintained consistent pressure on policymakers year-round. This approach proved devastatingly effective. While democratic organizations focused on winning specific elections, the network focused on changing the underlying conditions that determined electoral outcomes. The network invested heavily in state-level political activity, recognizing that state governments controlled many policy areas that directly affected business interests. Environmental regulations, labor laws, tax policies, and business licensing requirements were all determined primarily at the state level, where political influence was cheaper to buy and easier to maintain. By targeting state legislatures, the network could implement policies that would be politically impossible at the federal level. Anti-union laws, environmental deregulation, tax cuts for wealthy individuals and corporations, all could be tested and refined in friendly states before being proposed nationally. The network also pioneered the use of model legislation that could be introduced simultaneously in multiple states. Rather than developing separate policy proposals for each state, the network created template bills that could be customized for local conditions while maintaining consistent national objectives. This approach allowed the network to coordinate policy changes across dozens of states while maintaining the appearance that these changes reflected local priorities rather than national coordination. The most sophisticated element of the network's strategy was its focus on judicial influence. Charles understood that many of the New Deal reforms that constrained business activity had been implemented through federal court decisions rather than legislative action. If the network could influence judicial appointments and legal education, it could gradually reverse decades of legal precedent that supported democratic governance over market outcomes. In 1985, the network established the Federalist Society, a legal organization dedicated to promoting conservative judicial philosophy. Unlike traditional bar associations, which focused on professional development, the Federalist Society explicitly aimed to change how judges interpreted constitutional law. The organization provided legal training for conservative attorneys, created networking opportunities for ambitious law students, and developed constitutional theories that could justify radical reductions in government authority. Over the following decades, the Federalist Society would become the primary pipeline for conservative judicial appointments, eventually placing 3 justices on the Supreme Court and hundreds of judges on lower federal courts. By 1985, Charles Koch had accomplished something unprecedented in American political history. He had created a parallel political system that could function independently of democratic accountability while systematically undermining democratic governance. The network combined intellectual legitimacy, organizational capacity, and long-term strategic coordination in ways that traditional political movements had never achieved. It could shape policy debates, influence elections, and capture government institutions while maintaining plausible deniability about its ultimate objectives. But the network's greatest achievement wasn't its organizational sophistication, it was its invisibility. Most Americans had no idea that their political choices were being shaped by a coordinated campaign funded by a small group of billionaires with specific business interests. The foundation was complete. The infrastructure was operational. Now came the real test, using this network to implement policies that would fundamentally transform the relationship between wealth, power, and democracy in America. November 1987. In a nondescript office building in Arlington, Virginia, a team of political operatives reviews polling data that will change how Americans think about their government forever. The data shows something remarkable. Voters overwhelmingly support specific government programs, Social Security, Medicare, environmental protection, public education, but simultaneously believe that government spending is out of control and needs to be reduced. This contradiction becomes the foundation for the most sophisticated propaganda campaign in American political history. The operatives working in that Arlington office weren't campaign consultants or party officials. They were employees of Citizens for a Sound Economy, a Koch-funded organization that had discovered how to make corporate welfare look like grassroots activism. Charles Koch had realized something crucial about American political psychology. People supported government programs that helped them directly, but opposed government programs that helped other people. The key to building anti-government sentiment wasn't attacking popular programs directly. It was creating abstract opposition to government power while exempting the specific programs that voters actually used. Citizens for a Sound Economy pioneered what political scientists call astroturfing, creating fake grassroots movements that appeared to represent spontaneous citizen activism but were actually funded and coordinated by corporate interests. The organization's first major campaign targeted the federal deficit, which had exploded during the Reagan presidency due to massive tax cuts for wealthy individuals and corporations. Rather than acknowledging that deficit spending resulted from reducing revenue while maintaining expenditures, Citizens for a Sound Economy blamed wasteful government spending on social programs. The campaign was brilliantly designed to exploit racial and class resentments without explicitly mentioning race or class. Marketing research had shown that white middle-class voters associated government spending with programs that helped poor minorities, while associating government investment with programs that helped middle-class families. Citizens for a Sound Economy developed messaging that consistently referred to social programs as spending, while describing business subsidies as investment. Welfare payments were government dependency, but oil depletion allowances were economic incentives. Environmental regulations were job-killing red tape, but intellectual property protections were innovation policies. This semantic manipulation proved devastatingly effective. Voters who supported specific government programs could simultaneously oppose big government without recognizing the contradiction. The success of the deficit campaign demonstrated the power of coordinated messaging across multiple platforms. Think tank research proved that government spending hurt economic growth. Policy organizations proposed specific cuts to social programs. Political groups funded candidates who promised to reduce government waste. Grassroots organizations mobilized voters who believed they were fighting fiscal irresponsibility rather than supporting corporate welfare. Each message was technically accurate, but carefully framed to promote political outcomes that served Koch Industries' business interests. Charles understood that successful political influence required more than just messaging. It required infrastructure that could sustain long-term pressure on political institutions. In 1988, the Koch network began systematically infiltrating professional associations that shaped public policy debates. The strategy was elegantly simple: identify organizations that influenced government policy, then gradually increase Koch-funded representation within those organizations until they could control policy positions. The campaign began with economic professional associations. The American Economic Association, which influenced federal monetary policy, received substantial funding for conferences and research that promoted free market positions. The American Finance Association, which shaped financial regulation policy, was encouraged to focus on research that demonstrated the efficiency of unregulated markets. Similar influence operations targeted legal associations, environmental organizations, and even academic disciplines that seemed unrelated to Koch business interests. The network's most ambitious infiltration campaign focused on the economics profession itself. Charles recognized that economic research provided intellectual justification for government policies, and that controlling economic research could therefore control policy debates. Beginning in 1990, the Koch network began funding economics departments at major universities, but with a crucial innovation. Funding was contingent on hiring faculty who promoted specific theoretical approaches that supported free market positions. This wasn't traditional academic philanthropy, where donors contributed money without controlling how it was used. This was strategic intervention in intellectual production, designed to ensure that future economic research would support conclusions that benefited Koch Industries. The campaign was remarkably successful. By 2000, Koch funding had influenced hiring decisions at over 300 universities, creating a pipeline of economists who could provide academic credibility for radical free market positions. These economists then produced research that was used to justify policy changes that served Koch business interests. Studies proving that environmental regulations destroyed jobs. Analysis demonstrating that labor unions reduced economic efficiency. Research showing that tax cuts for wealthy individuals stimulated overall economic growth. Most of this research was technically competent, but methodologically biased in ways that were difficult for non-specialists to detect. The studies used appropriate statistical techniques and peer review processes, but began with assumptions and research questions that predetermined their conclusions. The Koch network had solved a fundamental problem of political influence: how to make partisan research look like objective scholarship. But the network's most significant achievement during this period was capturing the Supreme Court's approach to constitutional interpretation. The Federalist Society, established with Koch funding in 1985, had spent the 1990s developing constitutional theories that could justify radical limitations on government authority. These theories weren't explicitly designed to serve Koch business interests, but they systematically undermined legal precedents that supported democratic governance over market outcomes. The Society's intellectual project focused on originalism, interpreting the Constitution according to its original meaning rather than its contemporary applications. This approach allowed conservative judges to overturn decades of legal precedent while claiming to respect constitutional traditions. Originalist interpretation consistently produced legal conclusions that constrained government authority while expanding corporate rights. Campaign finance restrictions violated free speech principles. Environmental regulations exceeded federal authority. Labor protections interfered with contractual freedom. The Federalist Society's influence became apparent in 1991 when President Bush nominated Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court. Thomas had been a Federalist Society member and explicitly endorsed originalist constitutional interpretation. Over the following decades, the Society would provide intellectual justification for Supreme Court decisions that revolutionized American governance. Citizens United, which eliminated campaign finance restrictions, Shelby County, which gutted voting rights protections, and dozens of other cases that systematically privileged corporate interests over democratic accountability. The network's judicial strategy proved particularly effective because it operated through ostensibly neutral legal institutions rather than explicit political advocacy. Judges who consistently ruled in favor of corporate interests could claim they were simply following constitutional principles rather than serving particular economic interests. By 1995, the Koch network had achieved something unprecedented. It had created parallel institutions that could shape American political discourse while avoiding democratic accountability. Think tanks produced research that looked like independent scholarship, but actually served corporate interests. Legal organizations developed constitutional theories that looked like principled jurisprudence, but actually privileged business over democracy. Grassroots organizations mobilized voters who believed they were defending freedom, but actually supported policies that concentrated wealth and power. The network's greatest achievement wasn't its organizational sophistication, it was its invisibility. Most Americans had no idea that their political choices were being shaped by a coordinated campaign funded by a small group of billionaires. Charles Koch had solved the fundamental problem of plutocratic influence in democratic societies: how to exercise political power without appearing to exercise political power. The infrastructure was complete. The influence operations were functioning. The intellectual frameworks were established. Now the network was ready to implement the most ambitious phase of its strategy, capturing control of government institutions while maintaining the appearance of democratic legitimacy. The foundation for this final phase had been carefully laid over 15 years of patient institution building. What came next would test whether democracy could survive when unlimited wealth was systematically deployed to undermine democratic governance itself. But Charles Koch had learned something crucial from his father's experiences with authoritarian regimes. The most effective way to destroy democracy wasn't through violent revolution. It was through patient subversion that made authoritarian outcomes look like democratic choices. November 1987. In a nondescript office building in Arlington, Virginia, a team of political operatives reviews polling data that will change how Americans think about their government forever. March 2009. Barack Obama had just signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, committing $787 billion to economic stimulus spending. For most Americans, this represented hope that the government could help solve the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. For Charles Koch, it represented an existential threat to everything his network had built over 3 decades. Within 48 hours of the stimulus bill's passage, Koch operatives began implementing what they called total mobilization, a coordinated campaign to convince Americans that government action during economic crises was not just ineffective, but fundamentally un-American. The campaign would produce the Tea Party movement, capture control of the Republican Party, and transform American political discourse in ways that are still reshaping democracy today. The genius of total mobilization wasn't its scale. Though spending $400 million annually on political activity was unprecedented for a private network, the genius was its sophistication. The Koch network had learned to manufacture grassroots outrage while maintaining plausible deniability about its role in creating that outrage. Americans for Prosperity, the network's primary political organization, had been planning for exactly this moment since 2004. The organization maintained detailed databases of potential activists in every congressional district, sophisticated messaging systems that could rapidly deploy coordinated talking points, and organizational infrastructure that could mobilize protests within days of receiving instructions. But Americans for Prosperity never appeared to be coordinating these activities. Each local chapter operated with apparent independence, developing its own leadership and focusing on issues that seemed relevant to local concerns. The illusion of grassroots authenticity was crucial to the campaign's success. Voters who might reject obvious corporate propaganda would embrace the same messages when they appeared to come from concerned neighbors and fellow citizens. The network's messaging strategy revealed decades of experience with political psychology. Rather than defending Koch Industries' business interests directly, Total Mobilization framed opposition to government action in terms of fundamental American values: freedom, individualism, fiscal responsibility, and constitutional government. Tea Party protesters genuinely believed they were defending liberty against tyranny. They had no idea they were implementing a political strategy designed to protect oil industry profits from environmental regulation. The campaign's first target was the Obama administration's environmental policies, which posed a direct threat to Koch Industries' fossil fuel business. But rather than opposing environmental protection explicitly, the network framed climate action as economic destruction that would hurt working families. Americans for Prosperity organized rallies where laid-off factory workers denounced job-killing regulations that prevented economic recovery. The workers were genuinely unemployed and genuinely angry about their economic circumstances. They just didn't realize that their anger was being directed at policies that would actually help them, while policies that primarily served wealthy interests were presented as economic solutions. The network's sophistication was evident in how it customized messages for different audiences. Rural voters heard about how environmental regulations threatened agricultural traditions. Suburban voters learned about how climate policies would increase energy costs. Urban voters were told that environmental protection destroyed minority employment opportunities. Each message was carefully calibrated to exploit existing anxieties while channeling those anxieties toward political outcomes that served Koch business interests. The most important innovation of Total Mobilization was its integration of traditional political activity with modern information warfare. The network didn't just fund candidates and lobby legislators. It created entirely alternative information ecosystems that shaped how Americans understood reality itself. The campaign pioneered the use of social media for political manipulation, developing techniques that would later be adopted by foreign governments seeking to interfere with American democracy. Sophisticated bot networks amplified anti-government messages. Fake news websites provided evidence for conspiracy theories about government overreach. Anonymous online groups organized real-world protests against policies that threatened corporate interests. The network's social media operations were particularly effective because they exploited the psychological weaknesses of democratic discourse. Democracy requires citizens who can evaluate competing information sources and make rational decisions about complex policy issues. But the network's research had shown that most people made political decisions based on emotional reactions rather than rational analysis. Social media platforms amplified those emotional reactions while fragmenting shared information sources that had previously provided common factual foundations for political debate. By flooding social media with emotionally charged content that appeared to come from ordinary citizens, the network could manipulate political discourse without appearing to be involved in political manipulation. The Tea Party movement that emerged from Total Mobilization represented the network's greatest achievement, a mass political movement that genuinely believed it was fighting corporate influence while actually advancing corporate interests. Tea Party activists were overwhelmingly white, middle-class Americans who felt economically threatened by globalization and technological change. They were predisposed to blame government for their economic anxieties, but they needed sophisticated guidance about which government actions to oppose and which to support. The network provided that guidance through carefully orchestrated grassroots organizations that gave Tea Party activists specific targets for their anger. Government spending that helped poor minorities was wasteful and destructive. Government spending that subsidized business activities was necessary economic investment. Social Security and Medicare, which Tea Party activists used themselves, were earned benefits that should be protected. Welfare and food stamps, which helped other people, were government dependency that should be eliminated. Environmental regulations that constrained business activity were job-killing tyranny. Patent protections that preserved business profits were essential property rights. The network had solved the fundamental challenge of plutocratic politics, convincing working-class people to support policies that primarily benefited wealthy elites. The Tea Party's electoral success in 2010 demonstrated the network's organizational sophistication. Americans for Prosperity had identified, recruited, and trained hundreds of candidates who could articulate anti-government messages while supporting policies that actually expanded government support for business interests. These candidates weren't conscious hypocrites. They genuinely believed that reducing government authority would promote economic freedom. They just happened to define government authority in ways that exempted the specific government interventions that benefited Koch industries. The 2010 elections gave Republicans control of the House of Representatives and governorships in multiple states, but more importantly, they installed legislators who shared the network's ideological framework for understanding the relationship between wealth, power, and freedom. This ideological alignment proved more valuable than traditional political influence based on campaign contributions or lobbying pressure. Legislators who already believed that environmental regulations destroyed jobs didn't need to be bribed to oppose environmental protection. They opposed it because they thought opposition served the public interest. The network had achieved something unprecedented. It had created political leaders who could implement radical pro-business policies while believing they were defending ordinary Americans against elite manipulation. The success of total mobilization revealed the ultimate power of sustained ideological influence. By patiently building intellectual infrastructure over 3 decades, the Koch network had reached the point where it could trigger mass political movements without appearing to control those movements. American democracy had been designed to prevent concentrated wealth from capturing government institutions. The founders assumed that competing interests would check each other's power, and that democratic accountability would constrain elite influence. But the Koch network had discovered how to circumvent those democratic safeguards by operating through institutions that appeared to be independent, but were actually coordinated. Think tanks that looked like universities, grassroots organizations that looked like citizen movements, legal foundations that looked like principled advocacy groups. By 2012, the network controlled political infrastructure that operated in parallel to official government while maintaining plausible deniability about coordination or control. The infrastructure could shape policy debates through independent research. It could influence elections through grassroots activism. It could capture government institutions through principled conservative nominees. And it could implement radical policy changes while maintaining the appearance of democratic legitimacy. Charles Koch had accomplished his father's ultimate objective, creating a political system that could produce authoritarian outcomes through democratic processes. Total mobilization was complete. The network now possessed the organizational capacity to systematically undermine democratic governance while maintaining the appearance of protecting democratic values. The final phase of the Koch political project was about to begin. Using this infrastructure to capture control of government institutions that could implement permanent changes to American political economy. January 21, 2010. At 10:08 a.m., the Supreme Court released its decision in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, fundamentally altering the nature of American democracy with a single 5-4 vote. The decision eliminates restrictions on corporate political spending, allowing unlimited money to flow into electoral politics while maintaining donor anonymity through dark money networks. Charles Koch had been waiting for this moment for 30 years. Within hours of the decision, his network began implementing the most ambitious political spending campaign in American history. But Citizens United wasn't an accident or unexpected legal development. It was the culmination of a decades-long strategy to capture the Supreme Court and use judicial power to implement changes that would be impossible through democratic processes. The case itself had been carefully orchestrated by the network's legal organizations. Citizens United, the organization that brought the lawsuit, was a conservative advocacy group that had received substantial Koch funding. The legal arguments were developed by attorneys connected to the Federalist Society. The broader constitutional theory that justified unlimited corporate political spending had been incubated in Koch-funded think tanks for over 20 years. Most importantly, the Supreme Court justices who provided the deciding votes had been selected specifically for their commitment to constitutional interpretations that privileged corporate interests over democratic accountability. Justice Clarence Thomas, who wrote the deciding opinion, had been funded by Koch-connected organizations throughout his career. Justice Antonin Scalia regularly attended Koch network donor conferences. Justice Samuel Alito had been recommended for the court by Federalist Society leaders who received Koch funding. The Citizens United decision wasn't just legal reasoning. It was the implementation of a coordinated political strategy that had captured the Supreme Court and used judicial authority to rewrite the rules of democratic participation. The decision's immediate impact was staggering. In the 2010 midterm elections, outside spending increased by 300% compared to previous elections. Most of this spending came from organizations that didn't disclose their donors, making it impossible for voters to know who was funding political messages. The Koch network had pioneered these dark money techniques during the 1990s, creating complex webs of interconnected organizations that could move money between different entities while obscuring its original source. A single donation to the Koch-controlled Donors Trust could be distributed to dozens of different political organizations, each of which appeared to operate independently but actually coordinated their activities through shared funding and strategic planning. This approach allowed the network to fund political campaigns without appearing to fund political campaigns. Officially, Koch Industries didn't donate to candidates or parties. Unofficially, the Koch network spent more money influencing elections than both major political parties combined. The network's spending strategy revealed sophisticated understanding of electoral psychology. Rather than simply buying advertisements for preferred candidates, the network focused on shaping the information environment that determined how voters understood political choices. Issue advocacy campaigns framed policy debates in ways that served Koch business interests. Educational organizations provided voters with information that appeared objective but actually promoted specific political outcomes. Grassroots mobilization efforts convinced citizens to pressure their representatives to support policies that primarily benefited corporate donors. Most importantly, the network's spending was coordinated across multiple election cycles and policy areas in ways that traditional campaign finance couldn't match. While candidates and parties focused on winning specific elections, the network focused on changing the underlying conditions that determined electoral outcomes. The 2010 elections demonstrated the power of this approach. Americans for Prosperity alone spent over $40 million on campaigns that appeared to be about fiscal responsibility and limited government, but actually focused on candidates who would oppose environmental regulations that threatened Koch Industries' business model. The network's candidates didn't just win elections, they transformed the Republican Party's approach to governance. Traditional conservative politicians had supported business-friendly policies while accepting the basic legitimacy of government regulatory authority. The new generation of Koch-supported politicians opposed the fundamental concept of government regulation as inconsistent with American liberty. They weren't just conservative, they were revolutionary, committed to dismantling government institutions that had constrained corporate power for over a century. This ideological transformation proved more significant than electoral victory alone. Previous generations of business-friendly politicians could be pressured to moderate their positions when facing electoral consequences or public opposition. But politicians who genuinely believed that government regulation was unconstitutional tyranny couldn't be moderated through traditional democratic pressure. They were ideologically committed to positions that served Koch interests regardless of their political costs. The network's capture of state-level political institutions proved particularly devastating to democratic governance. While national politics received media attention, state governments controlled many policies that directly affected daily life. Voting procedures, education funding, environmental protection, labor rights, and healthcare access. By 2012, the Koch network had achieved governing majorities in over 20 state legislatures, allowing them to implement radical policy changes with minimal public scrutiny. The network's state-level strategy focused on three priority areas that would create permanent advantages for conservative political movements: voting restrictions, gerrymandering, and constitutional conventions. Voting restrictions were justified as preventing voter fraud, but were actually designed to reduce participation among demographic groups that typically supported Democratic candidates. Strict voter ID requirements, reduced early voting opportunities, and purges of voter registration rolls all had disproportionate impacts on minority, elderly, and low-income citizens. The network's research had shown that these groups were most likely to support government programs that redistributed wealth from corporations to ordinary citizens. Reducing their political participation would therefore create more favorable electoral conditions for candidates who opposed such redistribution. Gerrymandering allowed the network to maintain political control even when their candidates received fewer votes than their opponents. By manipulating legislative district boundaries, Republican politicians could create safe seats that insulated them from electoral accountability, while maximizing their representation relative to their actual voter support. Constitutional conventions represented the network's most ambitious long-term objective: rewriting state constitutions to eliminate government authority over economic policy. The network had identified constitutional provisions in multiple states that could be amended to require balanced budgets, limit tax authority, and reduce regulatory power. If enough states adopted similar constitutional changes, they could pressure Congress to call a national constitutional convention that could implement these restrictions at the federal level. This strategy would allow the network to implement radical limitations on democratic governance through legal processes that avoided the political opposition such changes would face if proposed through normal legislative procedures. By 2014, the Koch network's political infrastructure had achieved unprecedented influence over American governance while maintaining minimal public visibility. The network controlled think tanks that shaped policy debates in every major issue area. It funded grassroots organizations that could mobilize voters in hundreds of congressional districts. It had captured judicial institutions that could provide constitutional justification for radical policy changes. It maintained vast financial resources that could be deployed rapidly to influence specific elections or policy debates. Most importantly, the network had created an ecosystem of coordinated organizations that could implement complex political strategies while maintaining plausible deniability about their coordination. Americans for Prosperity could organize rallies against environmental regulations. The Cato Institute could provide intellectual justification for those positions. The Federalist Society could develop legal arguments that courts could use to implement those policies. Donors' Trust could fund all these activities while concealing their common source. Each organization appeared to operate independently, but they actually functioned as components of an integrated political machine that could shape American governance across multiple institutions and policy areas. The network had solved the fundamental challenge of plutocratic influence in democratic societies: how to exercise systematic political control while avoiding democratic accountability. Traditional democratic theory assumed that competing interests would check each other's power, and that electoral competition would prevent any single group from capturing government institutions. But the Koch network had discovered how to circumvent these democratic safeguards by operating through institutions that appeared to be independent, but were actually coordinated by shared funding and strategic planning. Democracy requires transparency about who is influencing political decisions and accountability for the consequences of those decisions. The Koch network had created a political system that could exercise massive influence while avoiding both transparency and accountability. By 2016, American democracy was facing a crisis that most citizens didn't even recognize. The fundamental institutions of democratic governance, elections, courts, legislatures, were still functioning, but they had been systematically captured by a network of organizations that could coordinate their activities while maintaining the appearance of independence. The final test of this system was about to begin, using this captured infrastructure to implement permanent changes to American political economy that would eliminate democratic constraints on concentrated wealth. September 18, 2020. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies, creating a Supreme Court vacancy just weeks before a presidential election that could determine the future of American democracy. Within hours, Charles Koch's political network begins coordinating the most sophisticated judicial confirmation campaign in American history. The nomination of Amy Coney Barrett wasn't just about confirming another conservative justice. It was the culmination of a 40-year strategy to capture the Supreme Court and use judicial authority to implement changes that would be impossible through democratic processes. Barrett had been carefully cultivated by the Koch network's judicial pipeline for over a decade. She had received funding from Koch-connected organizations during her academic career. She had participated in Federalist Society conferences that shaped conservative legal theory. She had been recommended for federal judicial appointment by network leaders who coordinated Supreme Court strategy. Most importantly, Barrett shared the network's constitutional philosophy that systematically privileged corporate interests over democratic accountability. The confirmation campaign revealed the Koch network's organizational sophistication. The Judicial Crisis Network, a dark money organization funded by network donors, spent $10 million promoting Barrett's nomination. Conservative legal organizations coordinated messaging that portrayed opposition to Barrett as partisan obstructionism rather than principled disagreement about constitutional interpretation. Grassroots organizations mobilized activists who genuinely believed they were defending judicial independence while actually supporting judicial capture by corporate interests. The campaign succeeded because it operated through institutions that maintained the appearance of principled advocacy while actually implementing coordinated political strategy. Barrett's confirmation gave the Koch network a reliable 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court, creating opportunities to implement constitutional changes that would permanently constrain democratic governance. But the network's Supreme Court strategy wasn't just about individual appointments. It was about systematically transforming constitutional law to eliminate government authority over economic policy. The transformation had been building for decades through carefully orchestrated legal campaigns that gradually shifted judicial interpretation of fundamental constitutional principles. The First Amendment, originally designed to protect individual speech from government censorship, had been reinterpreted to protect corporate political spending as a form of free expression. This allowed unlimited money to flow into electoral politics while providing constitutional justification for eliminating campaign finance restrictions. The Commerce Clause, originally designed to prevent states from interfering with interstate trade, had been reinterpreted to prevent federal government from regulating economic activity that affected interstate commerce. This constitutional theory could be used to eliminate environmental regulations, labor protections, and financial oversight that constrained corporate activity. The Equal Protection Clause, originally designed to protect minorities from discrimination, had been reinterpreted to prevent government from implementing policies that redistributed wealth from corporations to ordinary citizens. This approach allowed courts to strike down progressive taxation, affirmative action, and social programs as violations of constitutional principles. Each of these constitutional reinterpretations was presented as principled legal reasoning rather than political advocacy. Judges who consistently ruled in favor of corporate interests could claim they were simply following constitutional text rather than serving particular economic interests. The Koch network's legal organizations had provided intellectual justification for these interpretations through decades of scholarly research, judicial training programs, and networking activities that connected conservative attorneys across different institutions. The Federalist Society alone had trained over 70,000 lawyers in constitutional theories that supported radical limitations on government authority. These attorneys then became judges, law professors, government officials, and corporate counsel, who could implement those theories across the entire legal system. The network's judicial strategy proved devastatingly effective because it operated through ostensibly neutral legal institutions rather than explicit political advocacy. Barrett's first major decision as a Supreme Court justice came in February 2021, when the court agreed to hear a case challenging the Environmental Protection Agency's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. The case, West Virginia versus EPA, represented everything the Koch network had been working toward for 40 years. The plaintiffs were represented by attorneys connected to Koch-funded legal organizations. The constitutional arguments were based on theories developed in Koch-funded think tanks. The broader legal strategy had been coordinated by organizations that received substantial Koch funding. Most importantly, the case provided an opportunity to implement a constitutional interpretation that would eliminate government authority to address climate change, the single greatest threat to Koch Industries' fossil fuel business model. The court's decision in West Virginia versus EPA established the major questions doctrine, requiring explicit congressional authorization for federal agencies to implement policies with significant economic consequences. This constitutional principle could be used to eliminate virtually any government regulation that affected business interests. Environmental protection, labor rights, financial oversight, public health measures, all could be challenged as exceeding federal authority unless Congress explicitly authorized each specific regulatory action. The decision was presented as principled constitutional interpretation, but it effectively eliminated government's ability to respond to complex policy challenges that required technical expertise and administrative flexibility. The Koch network had achieved something unprecedented, using judicial authority to implement policy changes that would be impossible through democratic processes. Environmental regulations that were supported by overwhelming majorities of Americans could be eliminated by courts that claimed to be protecting constitutional principles. Labor protections that helped working families could be struck down as violations of economic liberty. Social programs that reduced inequality could be ruled unconstitutional as governmental overreach. Each judicial decision could be justified through sophisticated legal reasoning that obscured its political consequences. The network's Supreme Court strategy revealed the ultimate sophistication of their approach to political influence. Rather than trying to convince Americans to support policies that primarily served corporate interests, they had captured judicial institutions that could implement those policies regardless of public opinion. Democratic governance requires that policy changes reflect the will of the people, as expressed through electoral processes. The Koch network had created a legal system that could override democratic will through constitutional interpretation. The implications extended far beyond specific policy areas. The network had demonstrated that concentrated wealth could systematically capture democratic institutions while maintaining the appearance of constitutional legitimacy. Future political movements could use similar strategies to implement radical changes without democratic accountability. Foreign governments could fund legal organizations that would gradually transform American constitutional law. Corporate interests could coordinate judicial capture campaigns that would eliminate government authority over their business activities. The Koch network had proven that American democracy was vulnerable to patient subversion by well-funded organizations that could operate through multiple institutions while maintaining plausible deniability about their coordination. By 2022, the network's Supreme Court strategy had achieved most of its original objectives. Constitutional interpretation now systematically privileged corporate interests over democratic accountability. Government authority to regulate economic activity had been dramatically constrained. Political spending by wealthy interests was protected as a fundamental constitutional right. Most importantly, these changes had been implemented through legal processes that made them extremely difficult to reverse through democratic means. constitutional decisions could only be overturned by future Supreme Court rulings or constitutional amendments. Both processes required sustained political pressure over decades, and the Koch network had demonstrated superior organizational capacity for long-term political engagement. The network had created a judicial system that could implement and protect radical policy changes regardless of their democratic support. Charles Koch had achieved his ultimate objective, using democratic institutions to eliminate democratic constraints on concentrated wealth. The Supreme Court victories represented more than policy success. They demonstrated that patient institutional capture could overcome democratic accountability in American political system. Democracy could survive authoritarian movements that operated through obviously undemocratic means. But democracy might not survive sophisticated subversion that used democratic institutions to implement authoritarian outcomes. The Koch network had created a template that other concentrated interests could use to capture American governance while maintaining the appearance of constitutional legitimacy. The final phase of the Koch political project was complete. Now came the test of whether American democracy could recognize and respond to institutional capture by concentrated wealth, or whether the network's success would inspire similar efforts by other interests seeking to eliminate democratic constraints on their power.